Good evening, everyone. I was waiting till we hit the magic number of 50, and I think by the time I finish this sentence, we'll probably be there. So it's my delight to welcome you to the 4th annual Dr. David V.J. Bell Memorial Lecture. My name's Bob Bernhardt, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Learning for a Sustainable Future. Unfortunately, our chair, Susan Langley, would have loved to have been here tonight, but an illness prevents her from doing so. I want to say thank you to York Environmental and Urban Chain for their support for this evening. And of course, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to begin this session by acknowledging the many territories on which we gather virtually today across Canada as the ancestral homelands of many diverse Indigenous peoples. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work and learn together on these lands. We must acknowledge the importance of incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into our actions, especially when it comes to climate conversations and climate action, as they provide essential knowledge and wisdom that has been and will continue to be instrumental in the fight against climate change. Alongside this land acknowledgement, we like to honor an Indigenous artist from our own territory. The beautiful piece you see here is by Anishinaabe artist Zawano Gizik, depicting the traditional interconnected worldview of the Ojibwe Anishinaabe, who have inhabited the North American Great Lakes area for at least 1,000 years. Now, first, a little bit about the lecture and why it's named after Dr. David V.J. Bell. He became a member of Learning for a Sustainable Future in 1995. He became chair of the board in 2006 and served in that role until his passing in January 2017. His passion, commitment, and dedication to sustainability and education over those 22 years left a permanent imprint on policymakers, educators, and youth across Canada and internationally. David had a long and accomplished career in academia at York University. He was a professor of political science, Dean of the Faculty of Graduate Studies, Dean of the Faculty of Environmental Studies. And again, we would like to thank York Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change for their support of this lecture. In addition to his academic work, David was a member of the National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy and chair of the Board of Directors of Park Downsview. As his picture for the program suggests, David was a true Renaissance individual in my mind. He was pictured with his bass. He was fascinating on many topics, and he was just a wonderful, wonderful person to know. His altruism was recognized with many awards over his lifetime, most notably the Green Toronto Award for Leadership and Sustainability, the 2016 Harry Jerome Award, the Clean 50 Award, and the Jackie Robinson Fortitude Award. And I have to mention, with respect to the Jackie Robinson Award, he is the third person in his family to actually be awarded that honor, as his sister Bev had received it, and his nephew Warren had also received it. So tonight we have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you who are all here to discuss climate change action and the role of education. I'm also excited to announce that following the discussion, we'll be sharing a sneak peek of LSF's 2022 Climate Change Education Survey data that would be published later this year. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the son of David, Jason Bell. Jason.
Thanks, Bob. I'm really proud that you've kept this, LSF has kept this lecture series going, and it's been so exciting to hear these lectures annually. I'm looking forward to this one, and I know we've been going through some strange times, and I certainly miss my dad every day and think about all the things that we're going through, and occasionally I forget he's not there and think, oh, I got to call him and tell him the latest that's just happened, and I'm sure that happens to many of you who've been close to him over the years. My family, I know we all experience that. I think that my dad would be really excited with this year's lecture. He's always been hopeful and would enjoy the title of Katharine's book, and I'm looking forward to hearing all of the speakers. And so I wanted to, on behalf of my family, give a warm welcome to the panelists and thank them for coming and sharing with everyone. So looking forward to it. And I'll turn it back to you now, Bob.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for bringing the welcome on behalf of your family. And we certainly do miss your father's leadership, his dedication, his caring, and just his friendship. So you're right. He's someone who we miss constantly. Now I have the pleasure of turning it over to our president and CEO, Pam Schwartzberg, for a few remarks about learning for a sustainable future. Pam.
Thanks, Bob. Well, good evening, everyone. And I'd like to welcome our 200 guests that we hope will be joining us this evening that have registered from across Canada. So a little bit about LSF. Learning for a Sustainable Future is a bilingual charity founded in 1991 by the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy. Our focus is education for sustainable development in the K-12 school system. We work with business, government, school boards, universities, communities, educators, and youth across Canada. Next slide. Environment and Climate Change Canada has invested almost $40 million in climate change projects for youth K-12 across Canada. And LSF is one of 10 charities being supported through this funding. Our Empowering Youth for Climate Action program includes a focus on research, support for teachers, youth engagement, and awards to celebrate the success of youth across the country. You're going to get a sneak peek at the research on climate change education a little bit later. Next slide. We support educators with professional development and resources. Our newest resources on climate change can be found at climatelearning.ca. And we provide support for students K-2, 3-6, and 7-12. Our youth forums, we've held 12 virtual youth forums this year, engaging 285 classes and almost 9,000 students. And LSF won the 2022 Clean 50 Top Project for our virtual climate change youth forums. Next slide. This year, we funded a record number, 273 classes, each receiving between $500 and $1,000 to implement a climate change action project. They're going to be reporting on their research and impacts and posting their projects on LSF's Our Canada Project website. And finally, LSF Sustainable Future Schools take a whole school approach, engaging staff, students, administrators, parents, and the community, using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to address school culture, teaching, learning, and curriculum, facilities and operations, and community engagement. So that's just a quick snapshot of LSF and some of our programs. And I'll pass it back to Bob.
Thank you very much, Pam. And I just want to note that many pictures of hands in the dirt. And I think if anything sort of points to someone who's going to have a successful future, it's someone who happily gets their hands in the dirt. So we hope to have time for questions at the end of the presentations that you're about to hear. So please post those questions in the Zoom question and answer box, and we'll do our best to answer them. If your question is directed to a specific speaker, please indicate their name at the beginning of your question. So we'll have two speakers, and then there'll be a Q&A, and then we'll have our keynote speaker, and we'll follow that with separate Q&A. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Naila Moloo. Now, Naila is a 16-year-old innovator, passionate about leveraging technology to address the climate crisis. On top of being a dedicated athlete, a published novelist, and co-host of the Curiosity podcast for youth, she's also designed her own transparent and flexible solar panel cell and a bioplastic made of duckweed. Now, if you're like me, you're probably going to want to go back and live your 16 years over again to see if you can even do half of what Naila has been able to do. Naila, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Okay, perfect. So I think climate change is the largest existential crisis that humanity is facing today. And with that can come a lot of eco-anxiety. I know that the next generation is probably going to be the most impacted by climate change. And with that, I also think that youth should be at the forefront of helping to develop these novel solutions and innovations. So for me, in terms of coping with my eco-anxiety, I turn to how can I create action and how can I start building my own projects. Next slide, please. So at the beginning of grade 9, and I'm in grade 10 right now, I started to notice a lot more solar panels being put up. I would drive to school, to the mall, wherever, and I was noticing so many more solar panels. And this was super exciting to me because, of course, I knew about climate change. It was all over the news. And so it was exciting that maybe we were making this transition to renewable energy sources. But when I looked into the statistics a little bit, I saw that solar energy only makes up 3% of our global electricity generation. And this was pretty disappointing to me. And I started looking into why this was, because I was seeing so many more solar panels on roofs. So what's the problem? We have so many more solar panels. Why is it just this super small percentage of our global electricity generation? And just through following my curiosity and paying attention to where these solar panels were placed, I started noticing this issue of accessibility. Because yes, it's great that we have solar panels on roofs, but we really only do have them on roofs. What if we could have solar panels on our windows, on our cars, on our phone screens, on any surface? And this idea for a transparent and flexible solar cell surfaced for me. I started doing a bunch of research into solar because I was very intrigued by why this hadn't been done before and if it was possible. So I was first just understanding, how does a solar cell even work? Because I didn't really know. It was my first time with solar energy. And then I started narrowing my research to look at the intersection that solar energy had with nanotechnology, because nanomaterials can be leveraged in a really unique way. And it's basically working with these materials on the nanoscale, and they can have exceptional properties. Next slide, please. So I started coming up with this foundation for an idea. I started crafting my own transparent and flexible solar cell design and just doing research. But through this, I also realized that I was 14 years old and there were people who had been working in this space for years and years. But although this was maybe a little bit intimidating, I also realized that I could reach out to them. These people are all online. And so what I would do is I would go on LinkedIn and just reach out to the CEOs and chemists at different solar companies, and I'd ask them for feedback. And so not only then did I have an idea, but I had a validated idea. And this did take week-on-week conversations, followed by research, followed by conversations, but it brought me to a much more concrete idea. Next slide, please. So I came up with this idea about 1.5 years ago. This is a 3D printed model of my transparent and flexible solar cell design. It's definitely not transparent and flexible. It's just to kind of show each layer. It may look a little bit like a sandwich. But even now, looking at that, my idea has changed so much, and there's been so much iteration just because of that week-on-week research and having conversations with various people. And so I just received a grant for this, and so I'm starting to be able to build it out in a lab over the summer and hoping to produce a proof of concept by the end of the summer, which should be exciting. But that is kind of in my current research within solar energy. Next slide, please. Now, the other field that I've been looking into, the other problem is plastic pollution. I was on LinkedIn about a year ago, and I saw this article on my feed about plastics. And of course, plastics had been something I'd heard of, because I think we've all heard of plastic pollution. We all know it's a problem. But I clicked on the article, I read through it, and it was giving some really devastating statistics about plastics. But then at the end, there was this whole part on innovative solutions. And one of those solutions was bioplastics, which just intrigued me immediately. Bioplastics, next slide, please. They're basically bio-based versions of plastics today. So our plastics come from fossil fuels like oil and petroleum and coal. And then you have bioplastics, which come from crops like corn and sugarcane and potatoes. And this was very cool to me. And I started researching bioplastics a little bit more. And I realized that bioplastics, amazing alternative to plastics, but they're still not perfect. And there's a reason that we're still using single-use plastics today, and we're not using bioplastics. And a really big driver of that is the fact that a lot of these bioplastics are coming from crops that humans need to consume, and also that take up a lot of land to grow. So if you think about corn, for example, if we were growing corn to the extent that we need plastics to be produced at, we'd actually be cutting down rainforests to grow this corn. And it's also taking away food from a bunch of people, especially that is needed with this height in climate change. So it's not even that sustainable or scalable if you think about it. Yes, still much better than the status quo, but there's a lot of room for growth. Next slide, please. So I started doing research into, are there different feedstocks that could be leveraged? Is there something that humans don't consume and that doesn't grow on land? Because this would really be ideal. As long as it can be produced cheaply, then this could be really great for the bioplastic industry. And I discovered duckweed in my research, which sounds a little bit strange, but it can double its biomass in as little as 16 hours. It is the fastest growing plant in the world. And I thought that this would be a great alternative to traditional feedstocks. Algae is another one of these second generation aquatic feedstocks like duckweed. Duckweed floats on water and algae is like below the surface. Algae is being looked into a lot, but duckweed not at all. And so this is where I started taking this idea and seeing how I could turn duckweed into a bioplastic. Next slide, please. So I reached out to the CEO of this company called Pond Biomaterials, and I started working with their company over the summer on this idea and also working in a lab. Next slide, please. And I was facing a lot of failure. Actually, I have been facing a lot of failure. I've been working in a lab since October now. And I actually still have no tangible product. I kind of thought I'd go in and get my product immediately and it would be great, but there was so much failure. I was working on a starch procedure for literally 4 months, and I ended up producing my lactic acid, which is great because that's what you need to be able to convert this into a polylactide bioplastic. But I found out just last week, we were running tests in the lab, and I don't have enough lactic acid. So now I have to go back to the very beginning and do everything all over again. And I think this has taught me a lot about resilience and figuring things out. And hopefully I can still get my proof concept by the end of June. That is my current goal. But I think, again, this iteration and failure theme has been something that keeps resurfacing with all of my projects. Next slide, please. And so when I look at schools and education with sustainability, I think there are a few things that we need to change. And so the first thing is redefining failure, because I feel like a lot of students may not even want to go out and try doing new things just because it may not work out. And failure is really looked down upon in schools. You don't want to go into a test and then fail it and leave and be like, that's amazing, I just failed that test. But failure is so prominent in the real world. And when you're working in science, especially, like I face failure every single week, and it's something that you do need to learn how to get past. And so I think redefining failure is the number one thing, and not putting such a negative connotation around the word failure. The second thing is project-based learning. Tests, I actually don't know how effective they are, because I feel like a lot of the time it's people going and memorizing things and then forgetting it. But if we had more open-endedness and more room for exploration, where people were going out and maybe, instead of doing a biology test, they were conducting some kind of scientific experiment or going to a local lake and, looking at algae levels or something that interested them, then I think honestly, it would probably have a much better effect on them. And it's much more stressful without grades and tests and things like that. When you're actually learning for the sake of learning, it's so much more fun. And that's why all the stuff I've been doing outside of school, it's definitely busy, but it's something that I really enjoy. And then that final thing is real world skills, like doing a root cause analysis, for example, learning how to network. These have been such valuable skills for me. And so if we were teaching these in skills or in schools, then I think this could just have an enormous difference in people's lives, because none of the projects I'm working on right now would be possible without that networking piece, without being able to do a root cause analysis and all of these different skills I didn't actually really learn in school. So that is all from me. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Naila, thank you very much. You certainly are impressive. Seeing what you've accomplished between 14 and 16, I can hardly wait until you're 18 and we get to see what you've achieved at that point. So our next speaker in this wonderful agenda is Daniel Sylvester. He's from the Birch Narrows Dene Nation, located in northwestern Saskatchewan on Treaty 10 territory. As an educator, he has always strived to help students understand that our relationships with Mother Earth affect our lives. He teaches this not from a textbook or in a classroom, but from the land. He works as the land-based coordinator at Mistawasif Nahiwawak First Nation School, located in central Saskatchewan, in Treaty 6 territory, where he focuses on issues like climate change, sustainability, water security, clean air, overpopulation, and others. Thank you, Danielle. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to say my 2 cents. I think when I think about how we walk on our Mother Earth and the stuff that we learn from Mother Earth, we have to be able to take into consideration our effect as human beings with our interactions with her. And these are things that we teach our students here in Mistawasif Nehewak. And when we talk about that word Nehewak, it's not just our identity as a people, it is our identity as how we've lived for generations and all that knowledge that has been created over time. Like for myself, I'm both Cree and Dene, and from, like you said, from Birch Narrows Treaty 10 territory. My family was displaced from their original land in 1965. So my mother grew up on the land, and I was born after they moved. And the effects already from climate change are really felt especially with our woodland caribou in the north. So what I tell my students here in the schools is that my caribou were like your buffalo when they were on the plains. We used to have millions, like our stories. There's one story from my great auntie that was told to me about how they spent a hard winter without finding any caribou. And one spring morning they got up and there were caribou outside of the house. So they were able to supplement that need for food with that animal. And that's something that has been passed on from my family to myself, right? And when we talk about our relationship with our Mother Earth, like we see things that our elders took for granted in the past. Like let's take, for example, traditional clothing. So if they made moose hide mitts from beaver or from moose or caribou hide, if they left them on the land, coming back after a couple of years, they would know that that wouldn't be there anymore. And with the introduction of plastics and metals and everything, we notice that they stay over time. So we have to be really careful with how we interact with that. And that's what we teach our kids here, is when we go to places, we're waiting for that opportunity for our students to take that action. And that's something that we find is a factor for us as educators, is time is something that we don't have, we know that, and time is something that is important. And when we compare our outcomes that we have to teach as teachers to our students and compare that to what's really relevant, like what Naila was talking about earlier, we need to have our students take control of that action. And when we encourage that within our students, like to give you an example, we had at the University of Saskatchewan professors here interacting with our students for a university class. And they took our students out, and we have water testing kits here at the school, and they did a phosphates test of an algae bloom that occurred here. And so after that event, it caused concern in the community because that was something that they don't remember in their recent memory. And so that professor is going back to her workplace and bringing that back, that testing back to our student to do it in a more controlled manner. Now, when that's something that I tell as a land-based coordinator, I tell that to my teachers and to my staff, is that we need to have that release of control to our students, because those opportunities through partnerships that we can create through they're relevant, they're important, and they're fact-based. So when you get a student who wants to try something like what Naila is doing out there, when they want to take that opportunity, we should capitalize on that, and we should support our students with that. So that's something that teachers have a really difficult time with. And I know as myself, as an educator, that was something that I really had to come over when it comes to my interactions with my students, because those real engagements create real partnerships that last over time. And it's always something phenomenal when I see students that I've taught in previous years, and they see me in the city, and they say, "Hi, Mr. Sylvester," and I'm looking at them going, "Hey, I know you from somewhere." And then we go back in the history of our relationship with that. So when we provide that opportunity for our kids, then they have purpose, they feel empowered, and they take control of their education. And that is something that is modeled in our traditional teachings. Our elders do it for us first. We watch it, we work alongside them till we gain mastery of it, and then they give us that opportunity to do it ourselves. And if there's correction that has to be done, then that's correction that they give in a really positive and growing way. Our elder stories and our knowledge keepers are something that is really, really important for us here at Mistawasas Nehewak, because through our elder stories, we get to hear the historical references that they talk about, their living memory. So if there's something that they remember, I don't remember, like for instance, this algae bloom, we were sitting with one student's grandmother, the student that participated in the water testing. And she sat there, and I questioned her, and I said, "Do you remember this happening since you were born?" And she said, "No." So that was something that we had a deeper conversation about. Our knowledge keepers provide the teachings also, and they help us to understand the context of where we can move forward with this, and how we can move forward in a good way with our Mother Earth. Our partnerships with other organizations and educational institutions are something that we're really trying to move forward with here at Mistawasas, so that we can have our students access different technologies, because we know technology is an issue here, and that's something that we have to do. So one more thing that we try to break down is how much colonialism has affected our relationship with our land. A lot of our land use area is taken away from us. So here in this province, we face a lot of questions about trespassing acts that have been passed, and that really impacts our relationship to our traditional places, right? Because a lot of those traditional teachings come from place. So here at Mistawasas Nehewak, just to give you a background before I'm done here, we take our students out daily. We take them out for half days. So we go out there on the land, and we do it in a really purposeful way, where we do a lot of tobacco protocols. So if we're taking something from the land, we have to show you're giving something for something, right? if we're taking our medicines, if we're taking anything from the land, we have to practice that with our students, because in that way, then they understand how they have to walk with purpose with Mother Earth. And if they don't do that, then we continue to perpetuate that I don't even know how to discuss it, but that mindset where everything is for the taking. And that's something that we can perpetuate in our students as we move forward, because that was never there before. So in closing, I just want to say, like, thank you very much again for this opportunity. And thank you very much for letting me speak. And moving forward here at Mr. Wasis, we will continue to work with our Mother Earth in that way. Thank you.
Daniel, that was wonderful. And I can see why your students would stop you in the street 10, 15, 20, 30 years later. I'm sure what you've brought to them is something extremely special. So on that note, Sam and Jen, do we have questions that have come in?
Thanks, Bob. We have a few questions, and we do have about 5 or 6 minutes for questions. So I will start with a question, Naila, that was directed at you. And one of those questions was, someone said, I thought it was so important how you're acknowledging failure as a part of the natural progression in science projects and in entrepreneurship. How do you think that this can be incorporated into classroom teaching to foster resilience and highlight the importance of perseverance for students?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I think it goes back to like the root of how we actually do things in schools, and how a lot of the time everything is based on grades. Like I find school a lot more stressful than I find all the projects that I work on outside of school. Like even giving this talk, I find much less stressful than giving like a presentation at school, for example, just because you have like a number attributed to everything you do at school. And it's so much nicer when you get to just do things out of your own curiosity. And so I feel like changing the way that we do certain things, like even giving out tests, like I mentioned, I feel like the way that we distribute tests and how you're memorizing a bunch of information and then you might forget it like 2 weeks later, is that the most effective way of learning something? And is that actually fostering growth and curiosity? Or could there be some more open-ended way to do that, like doing some kind of project and then getting feedback on that and getting to iterate on it, and maybe even doing something longer term throughout specific classes? I feel like that would just be so much better for curiosity. And it's been proven, there have been so many studies showing that students love learning, they love exploring, but then when you start grading them on it and you start giving them a number on what they're doing, people enjoy it a lot less. And that makes sense, because then there's this layer of stress. And so I feel like by doing projects, doing longer term things, that's how you can encourage failure. Because if you're going out and you're running your own experiments, there's not always going to be someone telling you what to do, and there's not always going to be one right answer. You have to train that skill of figuring it out and battling with failure a little bit when things don't go right. And so I think that is a great way of doing it. I think it's something a lot of schools can implement.
Thank you so much.
A question for Daniel. Why do you think it's so difficult for teachers to let go and provide these meaningful real-life learning experiences for students like you do? And how can they get started?
I think the problem is our focus. So when we talk about standardization, and we talk about how we assess students, like what you're saying now, that those are things that we, as educators, from a division perspective, we're given that control is taken away from us, right? So I think that control has to be given, and that trust has to be given back to the teachers, because if we're looking at a concept that's shared, like grouping, for instance, that started in kindergarten in mathematics and is carried all the way across through grade 12. And if we can capitalize on what it is, then we can understand what the purpose of that grouping, like the concept of grouping, is for the different levels for the students. And I think a lot of teachers are stuck in that focus of, I have my grade, I have my students, I have my outcomes, right? And they don't see the further branching of that. And when they create that anxiety within our students, then it doesn't help them to become trauma informed in that way. And that's something that people really need to understand, is how trauma affects our students.
So important. Thank you, Daniel. I have another question for Naila. You mentioned that the work that you are doing outside of school. So how have you been given opportunities in school to do some of this project learning, if or how have you been given those opportunities?
Right. So I don't think a lot of the work and like research I'm doing hasn't really been a part of school. I think school has been great. Like the school I go to is amazing and I love my teachers and my friends and everything. And it's a great foundation because I'm learning some of these scientific concepts like chemistry and physics and bio, which is great because then I can leverage those and actually apply them. But I would say in school, it's not very applied for me. It's more just learning something and then not doing too much with it. And so I take some of the things that I learn and then I do apply them to what I'm doing. So when I'm going out and building my bioplastic, what I'm learning in chemistry class is really helpful for that. But I feel like applying it is something I've always tried to do outside of school because there haven't been too many opportunities inside of school to actually build and do this kind of engineering. But one thing that has been super helpful for me has been I joined the Knowledge Society last year, and that's what made me really start thinking about taking my interest in building out projects. And so if there are any youth listening in or any parents as well, like that has been a super life-changing program for me personally, and it was a big driver for all of my projects. So I think that was a big thing for me, actually taking what I was learning and applying it to real world projects.
Thanks so much, Naila. I think that's unfortunately all the time we have for questions right now, but we might have a few more minutes at the other end. So thank you both again.
Great questions and even better answers. So right now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Katharine Hayhoe, a climate scientist. She's an atmospheric scientist whose research focuses on understanding what climate change means for people and places, particularly where we live. She's a chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy and a Horn Distinguished Professor and Endowed Professor of Public Policy and Public Law in the Department of Political Science at Texas Tech University. Her book, Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World, was released in September 2021, and we need that hope and we need guidance for that healing. So Katharine, please teach us.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. In addition to all of those things, I am also from Toronto, Etobicoke to be very specific. Many connections through me and my family throughout the Toronto area. And in fact, I was just back in Toronto last week, although right now I am in Texas. So I am a climate scientist. I study what is happening to this world. And several years ago, I started to notice that wherever I was, whoever I was talking to, I started to get the same two questions. What gives you hope? And how do I have conversations about this with people? So I have talked with people across Canada, across the US, around the world, students, senior citizens, church groups, Rotary clubs, you name it. We want to know, when it comes to climate change, what gives us hope. So this past year, I wrote a book about it. It's called Saving Us. You can get it from the library or from Indigo or from anywhere else. The books are sold or lent. And it answers those questions with stories, with lots of analogies, with lots of personal examples, but also with a lot of science. But not the science that tells us about the ice sheets and polar bears, but rather the science that tells us about how we as humans interact with and respond to information, especially information that we don't want to hear. So let me share my screen here. Here we go. And the book, like I said, is called Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World. Why did I call it this? Why didn't I call it Saving the Planet, as so many other books are called about this topic? It's because it really isn't about saving the planet. The planet itself, this ball of rock, will continue to orbit the sun long after we're gone. What's at risk are all of us living things that depend on this planet. It really is about saving us. And then, even though that might sound simple, it's actually a profound shift. because it's no longer about me or the planet. It's about all of us. It's either all of us or none of us. We need the planet. It doesn't need us. And so it's not about saving something else for its own behalf. It's about every living thing of which each one of us is one. Why? Because when we talk about the issue of climate change, the reason we care about it is not because of a 2 or 3 degree increase in the average temperature of the planet, if that was the only thing that was happening. We care about it because it is quite literally affecting the water we drink, and we all need water. It's affecting the air we breathe, and we all need air. It's affecting the food that we eat, and we all need food. And it's affecting every aspect of our infrastructure, our roads and buildings, our energy and power systems and water systems. Everything we have built was built for a planet that no longer exists. Climate is changing faster than any time in the history of human civilization on this planet. And it matters because it affects us. One of the biggest ways that climate change is affecting us that we can see with our eyes is through what I call global weirding. Not global warming, but global weirding. Climate change is making our weather weird. Crazy heat waves, huge wildfires, really intense droughts, enormous hurricanes. Category 2 hurricane hitting Halifax. Record-breaking heat waves out in BC last summer where Lytton, the town of Lytton, smashed the Canadian all-time heat record 1 day, 2 days, 3 days in a row, and then 90% of the town was lost to a wildfire. I live in Texas, where right now we are in record-breaking drought. This drought is the most intense drought that this whole southwestern US region has seen since as long as tree ring records go back over 1,200 years in this area. And there's a record-breaking wildfire right next door in New Mexico right now, the biggest one in the state's history, with, of course, smoke that you can see all the way over here. We're seeing this global weirding all around the world. We're seeing it right here in Canada, and we're seeing it on the other side of the world, in Bangladesh, in Madagascar, in the Philippines. What does this mean? It means to care about climate change, we don't have to be a certain type of person. We don't have to live in a certain place. We don't have to care about a certain thing. Everybody needs food to eat. Everybody needs water to drink. Everybody wants a safe place to live. And if we don't fix climate change, we won't have any of those things. And what that means is whoever you are and whoever someone else is, you're already the perfect person to care about climate change because of who you love, what you love, and where you love. And all of a sudden, it's no longer a, oh, that's their issue thing. It's an everything issue, all of us. Now, climate change affects all of us, but it doesn't affect us all equally. When you look at who has produced all of the heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, it turns out that the poorest 50% of people in the world have produced 7% of this extra blanket. The richest 10% have produced half of it. We are all responsible, but some of us are much more responsible than others. And what's even worse is the impacts are falling disproportionately on those who are least responsible for the problem. Women and girls, especially in low-income countries, Indigenous peoples, Black and brown neighborhoods in the US and in Canada. Wherever we look, people who are already marginalized, people who are already disadvantaged, people who are already discriminated against, they are the ones who are most impacted by a changing climate. And in fact, if you just look at countries, the economic gap between some of the richest and poorest countries in the world, and we count ourselves among the richest, has already increased by 25% since the 1960s. Climate change affects us all, but it affects those who have contributed the least to the problem the most, and that is not fair. So we have this huge global issue that affects all of us, that's unprecedented in the history of our planet, that affects the marginalized and vulnerable people more than anyone. It's no surprise that when I ask people, how do you feel about climate change? These are the answers I typically get. Often when I give presentations, I use interactive polling. I couldn't today due to the format, but this is a poll I did with Ontario architects a few weeks ago. But I could ask this question of any group, including you, and I'm pretty sure I would get a lot of the same answers. We feel anxious, overwhelmed, concerned, worried, scared, frustrated, despondent, frightened, and helpless. And no wonder we feel that way. In fact, polling shows across all of North America that in Canada, especially, 75% of us are worried about it, 70% in the US, 86% of young people, but half of us feel hopeless and helpless and don't know where to start, and only 8% of us are activated. So we're worried, we're anxious, but we don't know what to do. So we do nothing. We think, well, he's got it, right? David Suzuki's been worried about this thing for a long time. We've got politicians who care about it. We've got some young people who care about it. And oh, the polar bears are definitely worried about it. And we think, well, maybe they've got it. Well, they, all except for the polar bears, and believe me, polar bears would be too if they could, of course they're working on this. But we need everybody. What gives us hope is not recognizing that there's a few people who are trying their best. What gives us hope is recognizing that we can do our best too. Greta Thunberg said something, I think, that's really important. She said, the one thing we need more than hope is action. Why? Because once we start to act, hope is everywhere. There's an intimate connection between feeling empowered, between knowing what to do, between being activated and finding hope. Now, when I say hope, people often, especially in these days where so many of us are anxious, scared, depressed, concerned, panicked even, people often have a very strong reaction against hope. They imagine hope is just positive thinking. If we just think positive, everything will be okay. No, if we just think positive, we'll just be happy until disaster hits. It won't avert the disaster at all. And then some people think, oh, well, we'll just bury our head in the sand like the mythical ostrich. Somebody else will fix it, so we'll just ignore it for now. Is that going to work? No, that won't work either. That is not hope. That is false hope, deception. What is hope? Real hope begins by recognizing it's bad and it's going to get worse. It recognizes the risk and understands what's at stake. It's the future of human civilization as we know it, and many of the living things that share this planet with us. That is what is at stake. It is not the planet, it is us. Hope accepts that success is not inevitable or even entirely probable, because if everything's okay, do you need hope? No. If everything's going to be all right, do you need hope? No. When do you need hope? When things are not okay. When we're not sure if they're going to be all right. That's when we need hope. But what hope also does is it doesn't stop there. Hope provides a vision of a better future and a path to get there. That's what hope does. And even the science backs this up. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change releases these big, giant scientific reports every 6 or 7 years. I refer to them as doorsteps of doom that show us how bad things are and how much worse they're going to get. But here's what they conclude. Here's the conclusion of all of their work. Every action matters. Every bit of warming matters. Every year matters. Every choice matters. How powerful is that? We matter. You matter. We truly can make a difference. So why aren't we? Well, these days, we suffer from a crippling lack of what social scientists call efficacy. Efficacy is the idea that if I do something, will it make a difference? And most of us these days feel like it won't. If I do something, will it make a difference with COVID? If I do something, will it make a difference with the war in Ukraine? If I do something, will it make a difference on climate change? Most of us think, no, it won't. And if we don't think we can make a difference, we do nothing. And if we do nothing, we feel hopeless and helpless. So how do we turn this around? We often picture climate action as a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of that impossibly steep cliff with only a few hands on it. David Suzuki, a polar bear, Greta Thunberg. And we think, well, I could add my hand, but if I do, it's not going to budge a millimeter, so why would I even bother? That is a lack of efficacy. But if we look around and we realize that there are children, there are grandparents, there are medical professionals, there are lawyers and politicians, there are teachers and entrepreneurs and innovators, there are scientists, there are all kinds of people who actually have their hand on that giant boulder, and that boulder is no longer at the bottom of the hill, it's at the top of the hill, and it's rolling down the hill in the right direction, and it has millions of hands on it. And if I add my hand, it will go a little faster. And if I encourage others to add their hands, it will go even faster. That's what gives us efficacy. So where do we start? What's the first thing we could do? Well, it turns out that there is one big thing that we are not doing. It has nothing to do with light bulbs. It has nothing to do with diet. It has nothing to do with travel. It has nothing actually to do even with fossil fuels. And I'll give you another clue. We are actually doing it right now. It turns out when you survey people around North America, most people are worried about climate change, but most people never even talk about it. We don't talk about it. And so when I was asked to do a TED Talk a few years ago, I said, I want to do a TED Talk on the most important thing we can do about climate change, which is talk about it. Because if we don't talk about something, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we ever do anything about it? Now, talking, of course, is not sufficient, but talking is a necessary first step. There's a man named George Marshall who studies climate change. He wrote a really good book called Don't Even Think About It, How Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. And as he says, talk is the fertile field in which cultural change begins. In its absence, it's impossible for a group of people to solve a problem. We can't do it without talking. Talking is the first step. The goal of the conversation is not to tell people about it, it's to expand the number of people in the conversation, to bring people in. The way I think about it is like knocking over the first domino. Having a conversation about why climate change matters and what we can do to fix it knocks over that first domino that leads us to the better future. Often we think climate changes and we get worried, so we say, okay, talk about it. I can talk about it. I can load up on all the scary facts about polar bears and ice sheets and sea level rise and CO2 levels in the atmosphere. But if we share information that is overwhelming, that is remote, that doesn't include any information about solutions or what we can do, you know what happens? It just reinforces the problem we have, that we're worried, but we feel hopeless and helpless and we're not activated. In fact, neuroscience shows that we just rejected even more in inaction results. Kelly Sherrod is a neuroscientist who wrote a really good book called The Influential Mind. And in it she says, fear and anxiety will cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. So that's not what I'm talking about. People often say, well, I'm not a scientist. How can I talk about climate change? Well, I'm not talking about the science. What am I talking about? We need to talk about how it matters to us here and now. And you know what? You are the best person to do that, not me. People we know are the most trusted messengers to talk about why this matters and what we can do to fix it. A couple months ago, I was speaking to a group in Iowa, and they said, how do you talk about polar bears in Iowa? That's our biggest problem. I said, well, unless you have a secret population of polar bears roaming around Iowa that I don't know about, you don't. I live in Texas, and when I'm in Texas, I talk about farming. That's Jack, a cotton farmer. If I'm in British Columbia or New Mexico right now, I talk about wildfires. If I'm in Ontario, I talk about floods. If I'm in a big city like Toronto, I talk about heat waves and air pollution and our health. Talk about why climate change matters to us here and now, And we also have to talk in the same breath at the same time about what we can do to fix it. I love talking about climate solutions that stop carbon from going into the atmosphere. Like what? Like efficiency and clean energy. But I also love talking about climate solutions that take carbon out of the atmosphere. We often think about tree planting, and we do a lot of that in Canada. But did you know that the biggest potential for taking carbon out of the atmosphere in Canada is not through planting more trees, but rather through smart agriculture that puts carbon back in the soil where we want it, where it fertilizes our plants, instead of the atmosphere where we don't? I love talking about climate solutions that help communities, like greening low-income neighborhoods that helps to reduce their temperature during heat waves, filters the air to produce better air quality, provides flood control when it rains, and green spaces where kids can play. I love talking about climate solutions that help people produce more food to feed their families. I love sharing how there's entire countries on board with climate solutions. There's entire companies on board with climate solutions. There's states and provinces on board, including even where I live in Texas. There's cities on board with climate action all over the world, from Edmonton to Houston to Chicago. There's churches and faith-based organizations who are on board. There's universities and colleges that are on board. There's young people and moms and senior citizens and everybody you can imagine on board. And around the world, in fact, 90% of new energy installed around the world last year was clean energy. The world is changing and we can tell people about this. So when climate changes and we get worried, what do? We talk about how it matters to us, that's the risk, and what solutions look like, that's the reward. And you know what? People feel empowered, and that's where change begins. Because that's the way our brains are wired. The human brain is built to associate forward action with the reward, not avoiding harm. So reframe your message so the information you provide will induce hope, not dread. Isn't that phenomenal? Does this work? I think it does. I talk to people all the time. I talked to Glenn, this is Glenn, who had been beating his head against the wall in his city to get climate action and nothing was happening. He decided, what do I have to lose? Let's just have some conversations for a few months and see what happens. After 4 months of conversations, he and everybody he'd talked to had 10,000 conversations in a town with several 100,000 people. The city council voted to declare a climate emergency. The next year, they put up £20 million, they were in the UK, for a climate resilience plan. And 3 weeks ago, they started a talking climate program for the whole city where citizens can come in and say, and talk about what a better future looks like for their town and how they can make a difference. I'm part of an organization called Science Moms, and that's my colleague Joelle and Russell right there. We help moms, and really anybody, through all of our social media channels on Instagram and Facebook and more. We have videos you can share about how every single person can use their voice to make a difference. And I teach a class, and I love this because I just finished teaching my class, and in their final essays, every single student in their final essays, out of 40 students, said that the class, which was all about how bad it is, how much worse it's going to get, how it affects us, and what we can do to make a difference. Every student said they felt empowered and they couldn't wait to keep going. One of them said, just as an example, being more aware of policies, solutions, and an abundance of ways to minimize my carbon footprint, I now know just how much impact I as an individual can have, especially if what? If I encourage others to join. How? By using my voice to talk about why it matters and what we can do to fix it. So when I talk to people and I ask them, how do you feel about climate change? These are the answers I get. But after I talk about everything I've talked about here, I often ask people again, now how do you feel about climate change? And inevitably, this is the answer I get. Empowered, encouraged, determined. I love that. This isn't easy. This is the fight of our lives. But if we act, I know without a shadow of a doubt that we can make a difference. So the only question now is, what are we waiting for? When people say, what can I do? My answer is this: do something anything and talk about it. Thank you.
What a wonderful message. So thank you very much. And just a comment that one of the things that has pleased me the most about the LSF programs in the schools is the single most common word that people use to describe what they do for the students is makes the students feel empowered. So that sense of efficacy is, I think, what we can give by getting in there and make those changes. Jen and Sam, what have we got in the way of questions?
Hopefully some doozies for you. So we have one from the audience. Any advice on where to put my grief and anger at people's, for example, my family's willful continued non-engagement? I find myself often too fearful and angry to do what you model.
There we go. Sometimes the people closest to us are the hardest to speak with. And we have to realize that we don't have to have every conversation with every person. We can have conversations with the people that we can connect with best. But a good place to start when we're thinking about our family members, people closest to us, is by realizing that they're reacting out of fear as well. Because everybody knows now that climate change is real. Even the people who are on Twitter harassing me, like I just had today, I probably had about 20 people from Canada on Twitter saying, oh, it's just a hoax. They know it isn't. They know it isn't, but they are very scared. What are they scared of? They're scared that the solutions, and I actually just had that article in the Globe and Mail, I should put a link in here because I talk about that. They're scared that the solutions mean loss for them. And here's the link here. I'll just put it in the chat right now. There we go. And no wonder, because a lot of the solutions to climate change are framed around loss. You have to do less, be less, have less. You can't have children, you can't travel, you can't eat meat, you can't live in a house, you can't drive, you can't. For many people, it seems like the cure is worse than the disease. But if I say it isn't real, but I don't want to fix it, it's affecting the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world, but I don't want to fix it, that makes us a bad person. And most of us don't want to be a bad person. So instead, we push it off. We say it's not that bad. It doesn't really matter. Somebody else is taking care of it. Or even worse, those scientists are just making it up. So your family, your friends, people who are ignoring this or speaking against it, it's coming from a place of fear. And if we think about that, often that helps us empathize a little more with them, that they're really afraid. They're afraid of what the solutions look like. And if we can talk about solutions that actually make their life better, and I have a lot of examples in my book of those types of solutions, some of them Toronto-based, then that often changes people's minds. In fact, in my book, my favorite story is from Australia. It's my colleague John's dad. He was completely against climate change. Every time John went home, his dad would have a new story about how it wasn't real, or there's more polar bears now than there ever were. Those scientists are just making it up. But then it turns out that there was a rebate on solar panels in the rural area of Australia where his dad lived. And his dad's identity was that of a thrifty fiscal conservative. He liked to save money and pinch every penny. So he realized he could save a ton of money. He got these solar panels. He saved even more money. It made him an even thriftier fiscal conservative than he already was. The solutions made him a better version of himself, not worse. He gained rather than lost. And so 2 years later, he and John were having a conversation. And in the course of the conversation, he said, oh yes, climate change. I've always thought that was real. And John was like, what? He said he almost fell off his chair. He said not only had his dad changed his mind, but he'd forgotten that he'd ever denied it. And then his dad went on, have you seen my power bill this month? Look at how much money I got back. So when we realize where people are coming from, that's often where we can find it in ourselves, to start with something we have in common, connect the dots to why climate change would matter to both of us, and talk about a positive, constructive solution that they can get on board with.
Such great wisdom. Thank you, Katharine. I see another question in the chat that says, I work in transport planning, one of the hardest sectors to decarbonize. I struggle a lot to communicate with people at work because they say they understand climate change and they say we have climate team, but in the same breath, they'll still support building a new motorway or massive tunnel and justify it by saying, oh, we'll put a bus lane in. They don't quite get it, but it's hard to talk to them because they think they do. Any advice?
Well, you're totally right. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. That's what a bus lane is like on a new highway. But you have to realize that they, like most other people, are probably worried, but they feel hopeless and helpless and don't know where to start. So again, don't start a conversation assuming that the other person has bad motives. If you do, it's not going to be a productive conversation. I would encourage you not to have that conversation. Start a conversation rather by asking questions and assuming the best, like, I know that I'm worried about this and you probably are too, right? Listen to them. So I'm concerned about what we can do in the transportation sector. I bet you are too. What are you thinking about that? Ask them questions and listen to what they're saying rather than lecturing them or assuming that they don't care, because chances are they care, but they don't know what else to do. And then here's what I love to do. Look for examples, because we live in a very different world today than 10 years ago. Look for examples of where people are doing things right that you would like to see emulated. Find examples of, hey, did you know they're doing this in Copenhagen? Why aren't we doing this? Did you know that they're doing this over in China? Why aren't we doing that? Look for places where people are doing it right and give examples to say, hey, and don't assume that nobody's on the same page as you. Assume that everybody wants to do the right thing, but we just don't know how. So really sort of coming from that beginning perspective of grace and forgiveness and empathy, realizing we're all complicit in this system. We all feel bound by the choices that we have not only made in our past, but our parents, grandparents, great-great-great-grandparents made. But we all have the ability to make choices for a better future. And looking at what those choices look like from here forward, that is what is under our control.
Sam or Jen, do we have one more or not?
If we have time for one more, then someone is saying that they read their book a few months ago and it was amazing. They're wondering what you do with those people on Twitter who think climate change is a hoax. Do you engage with them and try to convince them, or do you block them?
So a lot of the people on social media are dismissive. And that's a great question, and a great question to end with. So we often think of people in terms of believers or deniers, and I don't like either of those words. I don't like the word believers because climate change is not a religion. It doesn't care whether you believe in it. It's like you could say, I don't believe in gravity, and you step off the cliff, you're going down. You could say, I don't believe in climate change. Doesn't matter. It's still getting warmer. And when the hurricane comes, it is not going to knock on your door and say, excuse me, do you believe in me or not? Before it floods your basement and rips the roof off your house. So instead, I like the 6 Americas of global warming, as it's called. It's from Yale University. And what they do is they show, let's see, did that work? Here we go. There we go. They divide people into 6 groups. Alarmed and concerned are the biggest groups. Cautious is next. Small number of disengaged, people who've been living under a rock the last 10 years. 10% are doubtful, but only 9% are dismissive. Unfortunately, the 9% who are dismissive are disproportionately represented on social media, especially Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Not on Instagram. Everybody's nice on Instagram. I get a troll on Instagram about once a week, or once a month. I get a troll on Twitter about once an hour. So, unfortunately, the dismissives are disproportionately represented. And I can figure out very quickly who's a dismissive on Instagram or on Twitter if, first of all, they're really hateful. I mean, if somebody wakes up in the morning and they just decide to find a random person they don't know and just hate on them, insta-block. Or if they say, well, it's just a natural cycle, and I say, here's a resource showing you why it's not a natural cycle, and they won't click it. If they won't click a link, it's because they see the link as such a threat to their personal identity, they literally cannot bring their finger to click it or their eyeballs to read it. That means they're dismissive, and there is no point engaging with a dismissive. In fact, I'm going to go to Twitter here and show you. I have a whole thread on it, and I'll put it in the chat so you can read it. Let's see if I can find it here. Leading. There we go. So I have a whole thread on how I don't think there's any point to engaging with dismissives, but everybody else, there is a point to engaging with them. So let me put this in the chat. If you're interested, you could follow up on it. And then the resource about natural cycles, let me show you some of my favorite resources while I've got my screen open, though this is a good place to end. If you go to my website, which is katharinehahoe.com, there'll be a little pop-up asking if you want to get my newsletter, which is once a week, giving you one piece of good news, one piece of science, and one thing you can do. Click on frequently asked questions and then go to the first one. I have a question about the science or objection to something that you heard, or I want to fact check something that somebody said to me. So just click on that and it will give you all of the resources to answer the frequently asked questions. The website again is just my name, katharinehahoe.com, and I will put that in the chat here. And I think that's a great place to end because that'll answer a lot of the questions that you might have in the future.
So thank you to our speakers, Naila, Daniel, and Katharine. You've given us both a reflection, I think, on how innovation requires an acceptance of failure and driving through from failure to failure to failure. Danielle, wonderful explanation of how important it is to help people connect with the land, connect with the contributions of those who've come before us, and certainly connect with Indigenous knowledge as well, I think was underpinning your comments. And then, yes, we all do need hope. And I hope that hope is one of the things that you've gotten out of tonight. So thank you to everyone who is involved. Thank you to York University. Thank you to Jason Bell and all of David's family. Thank you, quite frankly, for sharing so much of David's time with us over the years so we could get to where we are today. And thank you all for joining us for this very inspiring evening. And thank you to the LSF staff to making it so wonderful. I'm impressed. Good night, all.